Hello, and welcome to the Glasshouse webcast. Today's topic, Desktop Virtualization Strategy, 7 Traps to Avoid, will be presented by Erwin Vollering. Erwin is an accomplished technical architect and managing consultant with a broad international background. He has extensive experience translating business requirements into cost-effective IT infrastructure solutions. As a services director at Glasshouse, Erwin oversees our opportunity assessment process as well as scopes and develops virtualization solutions for our clients. Ladies and gentlemen, Erwin Vollering.
Thank you, Natalia, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. As Natalia said, my presentation will be about desktop virtualization and how the whole process works. Some things to consider and definitely some things to avoid. So if we look at the agenda for this presentation, initially we'll talk a little bit about readiness for VDI. Is it something for me? It's something that works in my environment that I could use, and what are the things that we should be looking at? What are the things that other companies are doing? The next steps is to prepare for VDI. It's never, as with many different technologies, it's never a good idea just to jump into whatever you're trying to do. So with VDI, we've developed some best practices around how to prepare for VDI, so you know when you start implementing and actually run the environment that it does what it's supposed to do. And along those same lines, thinking through, so actually designing your environment, looking at the different pitfalls, looking at the different aspects of the environment. And our last topic will be, let's say, change is scary, where we'll focus a little bit on the actual transition into desktop, virtual desktop environment, and not so much on the actual implementation, but more what it does to a user and how we can soften the blow a little bit into a new virtual desktop environment. So as I just said, readiness for VDI is an important topic, and it's something that we spend a decent amount of time on when doing engagements with customers. And it's really about taking a step back and analyzing what's going on in the industry, what's happening, what's the fit of VDI for me. On your slide, so you can see number of factors that increase complexity and questions that we typically ask when doing an engagement. The number of users in an organization or geographical locations, they all have an impact on the choice whether you actually should be doing VDI and how you should be doing it. Geographical locations could dictate broker choices or storage design, and the same thing with applications and the number of mobile users versus static users. So what are the endpoints that are accessing the environment? And those are all questions those are all factors that have an impact on the design of your virtual desktop environment, and basically the choice whether you should move forward and how you should move forward. A bunch of key questions that we'd like to ask is, and don't worry, I won't read them all to you. You can read it for yourself. But current state, future state. So where are we now, and how will that fit into a VDI environment? Are we already heavily invested in a certain hypervisor technology, or is our WAN maybe not what it should be? Since we're moving, when doing VDI, you're moving to a situation where you're more heavily relying on your WAN. Applications, do I even know how many applications I have, and are the sources known, or is there documentation? Do they run on Windows 7 if you're moving to Windows 7 at the same time? Different questions that need to be, need to be addressed before actually making the decision that you are doing virtual desktops, and how much time you spend on these questions and really diving into the different aspects of VDI. It really depends on how I guess, on the scale of the project that you're trying to do. For smaller projects, it's maybe not that relevant because it's for smaller projects it may be a little less relevant to answer all those questions up front and to address them more heavily. However, for larger scale and when addressing more use cases, it may make sense to spend a little bit more time really looking at all these different aspects. And the ones that you see on the screen are really the different aspects that we see in basically any workspace migration, but more so in virtual workspace migrations. And again, depending on the industry and on your organization, you may spend a little bit more time on the application part than on the future state part or on your local user data. If there's no local user data, some customers don't have roaming profiles and have everything local and therefore also are looking at a data migration. Others have already centralized everything and are using roaming profiles, for example, and then the step to virtual desktops is a lot easier because then you only have to use it, only have to look at the user persona part. So it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish and how you're trying to do it. But these questions are really some things that will help you look into your organization and determine whether you should move forward with VDI and in what form. So if you look at the drivers that we're seeing today, it's a lot of Windows 7 since the deadline for Windows XP is approaching. It's not, I guess it's not the biggest driver or the primary driver where we see customers move to 100% VDI environment and using Windows 7 to achieve that, to accomplish that. But it's definitely part of the movement to a virtual device, virtual desktop infrastructure. Same thing for workspace mobility. It's still a hype word or a buzzword, the bring your own computer strategy, but it's there. I mean, mobility is there. People use iPads and use their devices, and they want to access corporate data in some way, some shape or form. And by virtualizing the desktop, you really enable those users to do that. So again, it may not be for 100% of your users, but for small user groups, it may make sense, and for other companies, it may make sense to do it on a more broader scale and look at the bigger picture and enable data protection and compliance by centralizing your data into a data center and approaching your desktop in a more holistic way. So it depends on the company or on the industry that we're talking to see what really drives the initiative, and it kind of circles back to this slide, to the next slide, which is where today's implementations are primarily focused. It's really changing. It's no longer just the large financials or insurance companies, but they are the companies that are doing it on a more, I guess, on a larger scale. So where you see one use case, for example, call center user, that is widely spread using a virtual desktop infrastructure. So it's not 100 users here, 100 users there, but it's about 1,000 users that are doing the same thing, using the same set of applications, and are a perfect fit for VDI infrastructure. But again, it's changing, and as the industry changes and there are newer technologies incorporated into the product, you can definitely see that there's an enablement for other use cases, and it starts to spread out to things that initially weren't that successful or were, I guess, the low-hanging fruits to choose when virtualizing your desktop, but now maybe become interesting. It's a market that's definitely growing. Personally, I think Gartner numbers are a little optimistic. I don't think we're quite there yet, and I don't think we're going to make the $65 billion in 2013. But nevertheless, it's a fast-growing industry, and a lot companies are jumping on the bandwagon and are developing solutions for PDI, and whether it be locally hosted or in some kind of desktop as a service setting, the private cloud kind of things. It's happening, and it's definitely starting to be on the on the agenda of companies at the moment. So if we look at some statistics around PDI, the first one is always kind of a shocker. Customers are starting to realize nowadays that it's not so much about CapEx savings as server virtualization was when it first started, and still is, I guess. But there are definitely savings to be had. But keep in mind that when doing a project, you may be looking at a higher capital expense, especially initially, because you have the investment of the software and the hardware and all the components that go around it, before you actually can start making money in terms of a reduced operational expense. A complicating factor in the whole thing is that 40% of 600 million PC users have laptops, and for the VDI market for mobile devices, for laptops, and I mean laptops with that, is still a little immature. So Citrix released thin client at Synergy this week, the version 2.0. So it's moving into the right direction, and it's definitely enabling mobile users and laptop users. But personally, if you ask me, doing virtual desktops on a laptop, in the traditional sense of the word, when you have your local operating system running on your laptop, users accessing a virtual machine somewhere in the data center, doesn't make too much sense. I mean, you still have the centralized management of your virtual desktop, so in terms of application management, it's still that single image somewhere in the data center. But don't forget, you also have to manage your laptop, so you still need to deploy patches, and you still need to fix things if they aren't working. So again, it may be a valid use case for you, but I guess at the moment we're not quite there yet. An interesting thing, though, is, and I guess the big driver that we're seeing, and I've been in this industry for a long time, so I've worked with all the versions, Citrix, MetaFrame, and WinFrame, and everything, and thin clients never really took off. And I'm not saying that at the moment they are huge and the next best thing, but there's definitely movement in the thin client arena where it used to be really about providing some cheap hardware, some cheap, basically cheap PC-like functionality stripped down to whatever operating system was running on it. And now you're starting to see that functionality is added, and it's looked at as a really a replacement for desktop. So there's more GPU processing power in those devices. The customers are, I mean, the vendors are definitely starting to look and provide zero client types of devices where there's truly little to no management on the end user devices, and therefore making thin clients a lot more interesting than they used to be. So I guess the perception always has been that the lifespan of a thin client is much bigger than that of a PC, which essentially is true. But don't forget, if you kind of cheap out on buying a thin client, so if you buy the lowest end thin client, you may not be getting the performance to be able to run the next version of Windows whenever it's released, let's say 4 or 5 years from now. So also with thin clients, it's really about, you know, what kind of performance do you need? What kind of functionality do you need? Are we doing local video and audio? Do we need any peripherals to connect to our devices? And if so, then you may be looking at a more higher end thin client device that's probably in the same price range as a PC, but still may be able to provide you manageability efficiency. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but when selecting your thin client, definitely look at that. And last thing that I wanted to discuss in this slide was the 30 to 40% of VDI costs are related to storage, and that's something that I'll circle back onto later on in my discussion as one of the traps. But storage should be high on the priority list of things to look at when doing VDI, and it's not a no-brainer. It definitely needs attention and care, because if you skip out on the storage part, you will run into performance issues, which will impact a large number of users and potentially the project and everything. So storage it's an important component of doing a VDI environment. So to prepare for VDI, we and as I said on the first slide, it's really about taking a step back and looking at the reasons why you're doing VDI. Once you've determined that it is a good fit and it's something that you definitely want to explore further, our approach, and that has been very successful, is to assess whatever is out there. And with assess whatever is out there, I mean look at client devices that are going to access your virtual desktop. So once you've defined a user group that you're going to target, which may be the whole company, which may be a smaller subset of the company, it kind of depends on your strategy. It's really about assessing those devices, assessing those users, and see what they're doing. So what applications are they using, and how are they using those applications? In our engagements, we used, as you can see on the screen, the Liquid Lab Stratosphere, as our many others are doing. It's a solid product that goes out to clients, to a certain number of your clients, and with clients I mean the end user PCs, and look at what those users are doing. So how many application launches did they have? What kind of disk I/O is happening? What's the network I/O? CPU utilization? And with those numbers, the tool itself will provide you an ideal match and everything. So you can actually create user groups and determine use cases based on what the tool is providing back to you. But we use this definitely as input for the next phase, which is the user profiling of the environment. So with, for example, on the screen you can see the application list for a PC and processes. With that information, we'll start profiling our user base. On the screen, those names are actual internal employees of Glasshouse, but they definitely show how different users need different compute resources and a different approach. So Dick Benton is a principal consultant, so he's a different type of worker than Andy Norman, which is our COO, or Monica, who is our finance employee. So they're all working for the same company, but they're all doing different things in a different application set, different times of day, and accessing their information in a different way. So realizing that and knowing what applications are needed to provide that functionality to those users is very much key in building and designing a virtual desktop environment. So the way we work is we have a specific piece of IP that we use, which is a large questionnaire that will ask you questions about where are those users, what kind of latency do those users have, what's their classification, would they need roaming profiles, or do they have user data, or is it more of a kiosk mode operation, or is there a reason why they need a persistent desktop or not, or certain types of compute power? But also, what's the business cycle? So is it monthly that there's a closure at the end of every month, or per quarter, or annually? And those numbers definitely help us define and design the environment. So with that information, we enter our decision tree, again, which is a proprietary piece of information that we've designed around many VDI designs, where we go through all those decisions and look at what the user's doing, look at their requirements, and at the end of the decision tree, we'll come to a reference architecture. And that reference architecture essentially then determines for that user group, what kind of functionality is offered. And on the slide, you can see as an example, and this is a general example, so there are no specific product names, but in a true design, this would say this is for lawyers, and it's a task worker, and for the solution we have hypervisor X and a connection broker Y, and we need add-on, let's say, application virtualization and profile virtualization, and the users need to access the device through the internet, so there needs to be some kind of SSL broker available. And this specific user group is both using a virtual desktop as well as terminal services or XenApp or something that will provide a virtual application to the user, so we can keep the virtual desktop lean and mean and as a single image, and augment that with virtual applications from other sources. And that's the description for this specific user group. So for the knowledge worker, the task worker or the remote worker or the power user or whatever, they could have very different reference architectures. And with very different, I don't mean that there are there's a large variation in the software that's being used. So if we, for example, determine that Citrix is the best way to go because of certain requirements, then we won't be introducing VMware View in the next reference architecture. So it's about making sure that you select the right product set that works for all of your reference architectures, and you won't end up managing a whole lot of different solutions. At the end, when you've defined all of those reference architectures and went through all of the data that was collected, and it's analyzed, it's rationalized, you've determined your use cases, you've determined the user groups that will access those use cases, and the reference architectures. Basically, what you end up with is the service catalog that defines per use case what kind of components you're using. So Bring Your Own PC won't have a Blade PC, for example, but does have a client hypervisor because it runs on the local workstation, and it uses terminal services to augment the application set from remote. Your power user, they have a virtual operating system, virtual applications, also augmented by terminal services and still local resource. So power user may still very much be using a local workstation with local compute power, and also virtual resources for maybe specific projects that the user's working on, or specific applications where it doesn't really make sense to run it locally, but can be virtualized. So the point I'm trying to make is that after you know what's coming at you, so what are your users doing, what are the IOPS that are being generated, what's the CPU utilization, what's your application set looking like, you can definitely start building those use cases and determining what your users are doing and basing your reference architectures off of those use cases. And with those use cases, then start building a catalog. So it's kind of like taking the components that have already been preset to introduce into your environment. So let's assume that there's a merger or an acquisition or something, and you'll be introducing a whole new user group into your organization. When everything's rationalized, it's much easier to incorporate those users without having to redesign your environment. So it's much easier to fit them into a certain bucket, or to just pick and choose different components of other buckets and combine them into a new one, as opposed to standing up this new one-off environment specifically for those users, because they perhaps didn't fit in a traditional definition or the traditional architecture that you've created. So it's about flexibility, and that's the important thing, and that's the beauty about virtual desktops. It enables you to be flexible, but it's definitely something that needs to be on the front of your mind when designing and when architecting an environment. Which leads us to thinking things through, and that's really, wrong way. That's really looking at our device, at our users, and defining the different components, what should be used for those users, basically making the technology selection. So in the previous phase, we defined the reference architecture, which is really on a high level, what kind of functionality do we need, and how do these users access this functionality. And in the next phase, when you actually start designing the environment, it's taking those reference architectures and translating them into actual designs. And again, based on whatever you're bringing into the environment, so whatever reference architectures and user groups you're bringing into the environment really determines the layers and how you should address those layers. So the slide we're seeing right now, it points out the different layers as we see it, and I have another slide later on that definitely shows you more layers and more complexity, I guess. But this is from a higher abstraction layer where it's about application layers, so providing functionality to those users. Printing layers, and printing is still very important, and although it's largely taken care of by the different vendors in terms of printer drivers and printer management, it's still something that needs to be considered, and how do you use a print, and what are the print times and sizes of print jobs and everything. So it's absolutely something that needs to be addressed when doing VDI. A profile layer, the user personality or the user persona depends on who you talk to, as it's called. So making sure that the user settings follow your user. Operating system, how it's built and how it's managed. So how do we deploy the new VDI image, and how do we deploy, and where do we deploy it to? So is it a persistent desktop or a non-persistent desktop? And how do we deploy it to that instance? So are we using SCCM to build the desktop, or are we just using images to clone desktops and provision those desktops? They may seem trivial facts, but they definitely could have a large impact on your environment and how you manage your environment. And the last part would be the endpoint layer. So how do your users access this environment? Are they physical PCs, or are they thin clients? And what's running on those physical PCs? Is it still Windows XP, or are we running some thin operating system version of Windows, or maybe it's a Linux version? And if it's a Linux version, we won't be able to offload flash. They're all things they're all different aspects and small, tiny aspects that are easily overlooked that will have to be considered when designing your environment and when translating that use case and the reference architecture into a design, whether it be low level or high level. And really, an aspect that spans the whole virtual desktop is the security aspect, and that goes down from the application layer, profile layer, operating system to the endpoint. Everything needs to be secured, and especially since we see that one of the large drivers for doing VDI is security and centralization and compliancy. Covering all the aspects of the devices is very important. So, because you're moving all the data away from the endpoint device doesn't necessarily mean that you can skip off, that you can skip, let's say, virus scanning on the device. I'm also not saying that you should be doing it, but it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And the same thing with your virtual desktops. I hear a lot of people say it's this secure environment, it's running in the data center. They're non-persistent, so when the user logs off, it's back to default. So why should I be running a virus scanner? Well, throughout the day when the user's on, the operating system is still unprotected, so it could still be infected and send out data and infect other aspects of your infrastructure. So again, I'm not saying that you should be running antivirus, but I'm saying it needs to be considered and looked at from your perspective and whether it's going to run or not. I can definitely tell you that antivirus has a huge impact on disk IOPS, for example. So offloading it could be a good idea. There are definitely solutions on market out there that will tie into your VMware infrastructure and help you offload your scanning from the actual virtual desktop onto the hypervisor level. The numbers that I've seen are a little bit mixed. Some are saying that it doesn't really make any difference at all, and others are saying that it's the best thing since sliced bread. So I haven't done any research myself, but it's absolutely something that needs to be looked at and needs to be considered when building an environment. I really didn't want to touch this topic, but because it's so important, and I mean, you all must have heard it a million times by now. But because it's so important, it definitely needs some attention and some pointing out. But storage is really the single most important factor when doing VDI, and it definitely requires a lot of attention, and it's one of the main reasons why we do the assessment part in the beginning of the engagement, where we look so closely at our end user devices and what those end user devices are doing. And it's not just storage; it's also about CPU utilization and applications and everything that the user is doing. But storage is really it's this big unknown, since traditionally you had this PC, and this PC had an X number of IOPS that it could handle, and that was fine. That worked great for that single user, and you hardly ever had any issues with that. And if you did, then it just affected that single user. But now that you're moving to decentralized environment and everybody's sharing the same resources, it's a game changer. So you need to know what's coming at you, and you don't need. It's not enough to work with the numbers that the different vendors have put out there. Say, well, on a steady state desktop, we'll use 15 IOPS. Well, that's awesome, but that's a steady state desktop. So are your users steady state, or are they actually working, and how are they working, and what are they doing? What's that application doing? We've had some customers that use monitoring software so it basically records every movement that a user makes, which is what's required for compliance reasons, but that really kills off your whole environment. And if you work with with the general numbers that are out there, then your VDI project will never be a success, because you've only scaled it for a steady-state desktop that doesn't even exist in your environment. So I'm also not saying, just take whatever numbers your assessment tool is giving you and multiply it by 10, for example, just to be on the safe side, and use that, because then you'll never have a cost-effective environment. But there's a thin line there that needs to be walked in terms of how to take those IOPS and turn them into something that works and that can be used. And it's really on my slide. I mean, there's math skills, standard deviation, and that's something that we've been quite successful at using is looking at the number of items that your users are using, and basically together with the customer determining what's important to us. So where is our performance sweet spot? What's the percentage of our users that will have to have solid performance? And if that's 99%, then yeah, you need more storage and you need more performance in your storage. And if it's only 80% because it's a DR environment, or I don't know, it's not business critical, then you can offload it to a different type of storage and save some dollars on that side. But by turning it into a science or into something that's known, you can actually predict what's going on and not make the mistake of assuming a number and working with that and building your whole environment based on the assumption. Because we've seen it so many times where it works fine at the beginning of the month or the weekend, then starts slowing down and comes to a grinding halt, and nobody can work. And that's really something that's easily forgotten. Where in the past, if there was something wrong with a single PC, that's one user. There's something wrong with one switch or whatever, that may be a floor that's affected, but now it could be your whole company that's affected. So again, not trying to scare anybody away, but realizing that it's something that definitely needs to be looked at is a very important step. And on that token, we've hardly seen a one-size-fits-all solution where there's just one storage box that does it all. And again, depending on the size and depending on what you're trying to accomplish, but it will probably pay off to look at what kind of storage solutions are out there and how can we leverage what we have using that. And that may mean that we offload certain parts of the environment onto SSD and other parts onto fiber channel, and certain so we can handle certain IOPS or certain IOP patterns better than others, or in a more efficient ways than others, because certain technologies handle those patterns better than others. But it's really about creativity, and if you just rigidly stick with this is our SAN or this is our storage device and we'll have to work with it, then we can definitely make it work, and it definitely will work, but it may not be optimized or as cost-effective as it could be if you look at different technologies that fit that given purpose better. And in that same token, your hypervisor selection is becoming increasingly important, since the hypervisors vendors started to realize that that storage is a problem, and some hypervisors are providing local cache, where you basically store your image locally and synchronize it back to a central location, or just use the basic image locally and then use the deltas from a shared location. Or there are different ways of approaching your storage challenge. But your hypervisor is increasingly starting to play a bigger role in the whole where do we store our images question. So if we chose hypervisor A, for example, 4 years ago, because it's just a wonderful product, and it still is a wonderful product, it may not be the best product for your VDI environment. There's also a cost associated with moving away from that platform. So again, it's not black-white. It's not saying that you need to revisit or you need to change it, but it may be worthwhile looking into. So one thing that's really one term, I guess, that's really out there, and some agree with it, others don't, is the whole layered cake and how you build your virtual environment with the different components. And this slide is something that we kind of use to show the complexity of a virtual desktop environment. And again, not trying to scare anybody away, but it's more about awareness and realization that it's not as simple as choosing your broker and you're good to go. It's your endpoint. Again, I talked about your thin clients and your lifespan of your thin clients and functionality of your thin clients. They're quite important in terms of endpoint choices, and your business case could depend on your endpoint device and your choice of endpoint device and how well it's managed and what kind of direction you're going into with your endpoint. So all of these columns are important when it comes to designing your virtual environment. Application streaming. Some of the different options are dependent to each other, and by no means is this meant as something that's complete, or it will show every product that's out there, and it's kind of outdated since VMware. I struck through the VMware one since they didn't have any, but now with View 5 they actually do. So I need to update this slide too. But there's a big difference between the Citrix and the VMware profile managers, and for example the Rex and the AppSense ones, or even the Microsoft Roman profiles that have been out there for many years now. And again, whether you need it or what you need, it really depends on how well you want to manage your environment and what your requirements are. But there are a lot of choices to be made, and by engaging with the right people and investigating the different options, you can absolutely build an environment that works across the board. And for example, just to show the relationships or the dependencies, your profile and personality management software could have a big impact on your storage design and vice versa. So again, it's not something that you should approach as this column. We check this column, so now let's move on to the next one. It's something that's more holistic and needs to be looked at from a higher section layer. And so, what are we doing with these desktops, and how are we approaching performance, and how are we approaching user experience, and the different aspects that matter for what you're trying to accomplish. So change is scary, and that's not just when approaching virtual desktops or changing anything, but change in general is something that scares users. And as I said before, I've been doing this a long time, and not just virtual environments, but also desktop migrations, and even moving an icon from left to right could scare users and completely panic users. So when doing a project like this that touches your users in such a dramatic way, it's really guiding those users through that process. And the challenge slide really shows the challenges from an IT, but also from a user perspective. And important one is the email services and local data. So what are you doing with your PSTs, for example? Where are your PSTs at the moment? Are they local on the PC? Are they somewhere in the user profile? Because if they are, then they need to be moved. They need to be stored in some central location, and perhaps even in your email data store, so you can do archiving. You can handle your compliancy in a more efficient way. Same thing with your service management, your ITSM. Your processes are going to change because your desktops are changing, and the way your staff is approaching those desktops and managing those desktops is going to change. And it's not end of the world or anything, but it's absolutely something that needs to be considered when doing a VDI implementation, and they just need to be converted into something that works for a virtual desktop. And that may mean that at other levels do certain activities at other times, but approaching those changes before you actually implement and migrate into a virtual desktop environment is very much key. Planning and scheduling, and that's really something that we created a specific piece of IP for at Glasshouse because we saw a huge need for desktop migrations, and streamlining those desktop migrations is I guess the single biggest impact. I mean, it's one thing to design a virtual environment that performs well and does everything it needs to be doing for your end users, but making sure that those users can actually access their data and their applications in time is a whole other thing. And that's really why. So we created a program called Reflective for Workspace. It doesn't really matter how you do it, but the migration phase is also something that that definitely needs a lot of intense attention when you're moving to a virtual environment. When your applications are ready and how they are offered to your users, and does your user even know how to access those applications in your new environment? So how to train those users and how to communicate to those users is very important and absolutely key. Traditionally, user may have had an icon on the start menu, and now they need to go to a web portal to access the applications, or even if you're more progressively, you're doing the self-service part where users can go to the portal and request the applications, and they are automatically provisioned because you're leveraging application virtualization. Or again, circling back to the BSD issue, where users have local BSDs, and those BSDs need to be moved and need to be imported into the data store or somewhere centralized. Anything that all has to be timed and executed at the moment your users migrating over to the virtual environment. So it's not a big bang migration or something that some switch that can easily be flipped. It's something that requires a lot of planning, and especially when dealing with different regions, different time zones, and the logistics of replacing devices. You need something to schedule that accordingly. So creating order from chaos, that's absolutely important, and don't forget about all those different aspects that are shown on the one of the first slides, where you look at the endpoint, you look at the application, you look at the user data, and that all needs to come together at a time-critical point when moving to a virtual environment. So to summarize, make sure that you're doing VDI for the right reasons. So really look at what is it giving us, and it may not give you your financial return in the first year that you're looking for, but it's increasing your functionality, it's increasing your ability to access application, and it's really increasing your productivity. So try to use those intangible aspects, or those soft costs, those hidden costs, or soft wins when thinking about VDI. It's a wonderful technology, but we've seen it works best if customers are really doing it for the right reasons and know why they're doing it and know what the advantages are. So it's easier to sell to your users, to your management, and it's a success on all fronts. And then assess and profile your environment by defining your users and defining your use cases. And it goes beyond just the standard task worker, knowledge worker, and power user and everything. There are so many variations to the fixed user profiles that it's not as we talk with customers that say, well, these are the industry standards, so this is what we'll go with, and then we'll just see how it works out. But you'll end up with this big, complicated pot of users that really don't fit any bucket or don't have a clear reference architecture defined with it, and especially if you didn't assess your users, you really don't know what you're bringing into the environment. So again, what kind of applications and what kind of compute power do those users need? So you're just designing based off of assumptions, and that means either you're under-designing or you're over-designing. It's very rare that you actually design it spot on. And it really goes back to peak cost and control. So it may seem a lot of extra work up front to assess your users and to spend so much time on designing your environment, but it definitely pays off later on when you know what's going into your environment and you know that whatever you designed is tailor-made for what you're trying to do, and you're not overspending, you're not underspending. It's going to give you the performance that you need for the right price. The applications are so important, and it's often something that's forgotten or something that's done at the end of the project, where we'll let the general idea is let's design it first, and then we'll bring on the applications. But the applications really are the most time-consuming of all, there are many ways of leveraging or reducing the time you need to actually assess those applications. And very much the same, we assess test styles. We also assess applications by checking for maturity in Windows 7 and whether it's virtualizable in the sense of install or TNF, or FE or whatever technology that you're using for it. But it really streamlines the whole project if it's something that's brought to the attention at the beginning of the project, and that perhaps runs as a parallel stream to the actual design and the assessment of your environment. But really don't forget about the applications. They're important. It's about applications. It's about functionality to your users. So it's not the last thing that needs to be considered. It's not the closing phase of the project. I've spoken about storage, and it's a major component. It's important. It really touches everything. Network is equally important, and compute power is also just as important, but storage is typically the most forgotten thing, or it's difficult to understand. Networking is quite easy. We've all worked with gigabits and megabytes and megabits and everything, but IOPS is a relatively new thing, and it's kind of a hidden aspect of your environment. So the user experience should be equal or better than what it currently is. That's a design assumption that we always make with customers, and it's so important that that really should be what your environment is based on. Because if it's not, your users will start hating it, and will start blaming everything on virtualization environment, whether it's justified or not. So please keep that in mind. And educate your users about changes. So make sure that they are informed and they're in the loop of what's coming at them, what's going to change. Make sure that you know what applications are being used by that user, even the one-offs, and whether they will be available or not in the new environment. It's really that's up to the project and up to how you want to deliver. But communication is key in that aspect.
So, Erwin, I'd like to thank you for presenting today's webcast.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody, for listening in.